Welcome back to Oliver's Stories. Today I'm going to tell you about the entire history of Napoleon Bonaparte. But here is the question that has haunted historians for over 200 years. Was he a hero or an oppressor? A military genius who won 60 battles and rewrote the legal codes of an entire continent. Yet the empire he built was paid for in blood. An estimated 3 to 6 million dead from Madrid to Moscow, all in campaigns fought to satisfy one man's limitless hunger for glory. It is December 2nd, 1804. Inside the freezing walls of Notre Dame Cathedral, a 35-year-old artillery officer from Corsica takes a crown from the hands of the Pope himself and places it on his own head. In a single motion, he ends the revolution that made him and alters the fate of Europe forever. Tonight, we unravel the life of Napoleon Bonaparte, perhaps the most debated figure in modern history. We will trace his extraordinary rise from a debt-ridden family on the fringes of Europe to the throne of the largest empire the continent had seen since Rome. We will see how the wars he unleashed destroyed the old feudal order, redrew the borders of nations, and spread the dangerous idea that people could choose their own rulers. And finally, we will reckon with the question that still haunts us. Did he carry the revolution forward, or did he betray it? Now, settle in as we journey back to a wild, rain-lashed island in the Mediterranean, where a restless boy is about to begin the most extraordinary ascent in modern history. This is the bedtime biography of Napoleon Bonaparte. The island of Corsica was a peculiar place. It had never been fully independent, nor had it ever been fully absorbed into any empire. The people there lived much as they had for centuries, subsisting on chestnuts, cheese, onions, fruit, and the occasional piece of goat or pork, all of it washed down with local wine. Even the bread was made from chestnuts. Wealth differences were narrow. The society was traditional in its structure, and yet every family carried a fierce sense of pride and dignity. You did not cross a Corsican household lightly. Any act of violence could trigger a vendetta from which there was almost no escape, because nothing stayed secret for long in such a restricted space. It was into this world that the Bonaparte family had settled generations earlier. Their lineage traced back to minor gentry from Tuscany and Liguria, and they had eventually put down roots in Ajaccio. The family home had been carved up over the years by successive dowries, leaving 7 members crammed into roughly 40 dilapidated square meters. In the summer of 1764, the 18-year-old Carlo Bonaparte married 14-year-old Letizia Ramolino. The match came with a dowry that boosted Carlo's social standing. Letizia was beautiful, strong-willed, and strict with her children. She administered slaps freely and without hesitation. It was a tough household. Meanwhile, Corsica was in the grip of something larger. Pasquale Paoli had proclaimed a Corsican republic back in 1755, governing from the hill town of Corte. He had established a constitution, institutions, even a university. But France could not tolerate a utopian republic sitting on its doorstep. Following the Treaty of Versailles in 1768, French troops moved in. The decisive engagement came at Pont-Neuf in May of 1769. The Corsican forces were routed. Paoli fled over the mountains and into exile in England. Carlo Bonaparte submitted to the new French authorities and turned back toward Ajaccio. On the journey home, while crossing the mountains, Letizia's mules stumbled while fording the river Liamon. She nearly lost the child she was carrying. That child was born on the night of the 15th of August 1769 and was named Napoleon after his great-uncle. The French military governor, the Comte de Marboeuf, needed loyal supporters among the local notables, and the Bonaparte family fit the role. Marboeuf became a frequent visitor to the household. He was so frequent that his closeness to Letizia fueled local gossip about the paternity of her next child. Napoleon spent a happy early childhood playing in the streets of Ajaccio with his cousins and summering up in the hills at Boccognano. His mother would later recall that of all her children, he had been the most intrepid, the most aggressive, the most quarrelsome, always pushing. But the French suppression of Corsican resistance left its marks on the boy. Mobile columns burned crops across the countryside and hanged corpses along public highways as warnings. These were the sights of his youth. Carlo eventually secured a royal bursary for Napoleon at the Military Academy of Brienne. The application required proving both noble credentials and indigence. The boy arrived at the austere institution run by the Order of Minims on the 15th of May 1779. He was puny, olive-complexioned, and spoke poor French, all of which marked him immediately as a foreigner and an easy target. He read constantly. He fenced off a small allotment of land for himself, a place to be alone. There is something about that image, a boy alone with his books, trying to piece together the entire world from what he could read. The school librarian noted that Napoleon courted solitude as though it were the thing he valued most. One fellow pupil remembered him as gloomy and fierce to excess, almost always by himself, never sharing in the noisy mirth of his schoolmates. The curriculum at Brienne centered on the heroes of antiquity, Plutarch primarily, and was designed to awaken instincts of chivalry, honor, duty, and sacrifice. When provoked, Napoleon responded with a ferocity born of contempt. He moved on to the École Militaire in Paris in October of 1784, where the atmosphere was more aristocratic and the presence of wealthy fee-paying cadets only deepened his alienation. He hated drill. During one session he hurled his musket at the drill master in a rage. He loved fencing but fought so aggressively that he would lay himself open to touches, constantly breaking foil after foil. He groaned at the frivolity of the other pupils. When his father died of stomach cancer in February 1785, the weight of the family landed squarely on his shoulders. Commissioned as a second lieutenant in the artillery regiment of La Fère, Napoleon was stationed in Valence by November of that year. He read voraciously history, geography, philosophy, and fell heavily under the influence of Rousseau. He wrote a short essay on suicide asking, "Since I must die one day, would it not be as well to kill myself?" He described himself as always alone while surrounded by people, preferring to sit with his own melancholy. During long leaves of absence, he spent 21 months back in Corsica, managing the family's dwindling finances and a failing mulberry nursery. He adopted the pose of the persecuted patriot, writing a history of the island that cast the French as barbarous occupiers. "I was born as the fatherland was perishing." He wrote to Paoli, describing how the screams of the dying and the tears of despair had surrounded his cradle. The outbreak of the French Revolution in 1789 found him stationed in Auxonne. Riots broke out. He marshaled troops against the crowds but expressed a deep distaste for the mob, complaining that he had been prevented from firing on them. He returned to Corsica, where he and his brother Joseph threw themselves into local politics, distributing cockades and forming a citizens' militia. But Paoli had returned from exile, and the old leader viewed the Bonaparte brothers with suspicion. Napoleon secured a command in the Ajaccio National Guard through intimidation, going so far as to kidnap a voting commissioner to swing the election. Tensions boiled over on the 8th of April 1792 when his volunteers fired on townsfolk and attempted to seize the citadel. Denounced by Paoli's supporters and facing assassination, Napoleon slipped out of Ajaccio by boat. In his absence, Paoli's partisans sacked the family home. Letizia gathered the children and fled into the hills. A French naval squadron eventually evacuated them, and in June of 1793, the Bonaparte family sailed for the mainland as destitute refugees. The rupture with Corsica was total. The young artillery officer who had dreamed of liberating his island now had nothing to go back to. What he had instead was a commission in the French army, a large family to feed, and a republic tearing itself apart around him. The Bonaparte family washed ashore in Toulon during the summer of 1793 into a city that had lost its mind. Jacobin mobs roamed the streets, hanging wealthy citizens from lampposts and beating others to death in broad daylight. It was no place for a destitute family with young children. Letizia gathered them up and moved to the nearby village of La Valette, where things were quieter, where they could breathe. Napoleon, meanwhile, rejoined his regiment in Nice and collected his back pay, sending what he could to keep his mother and siblings fed. He also dashed off a political pamphlet called Le Souper de Bouquet, a pointed defense of the Jacobin government that served a second purpose, distancing the family name from Paoli and any whiff of counter-revolution. It was not long before Toulon made headlines again. Royalist insurgents had seized the city and handed it, along with the entire French Mediterranean fleet, over to the British Royal Navy. The Republic dispatched an army of raw recruits to take it back, led by General Cato, a painter by trade with about as much military experience as you would expect from one. The besieging artillery needed a commander after the previous one took a wound, and the Corsican deputy Salisti knew just who to call. Napoleon arrived and sized up the situation fast. The key was a promontory overlooking the outer harbor. Take that, and the British ships would have no choice but to pull out. His superiors did not see it that way, but Napoleon had stopped listening to them. He stripped surrounding posts of cannons, powder, and horses, building up an artillery park from almost nothing. He set up foundries to cast cannonballs. He trained infantrymen to serve as gunners. At night he slept on the ground beside his batteries, wrapped in his cloak, close enough to feel the heat of the barrels. General Dufort, observing from a comfortable distance, noted that the young officer combined rare bravery and indefatigable energy with considerable talent. The final assault on Fort Mulgrave came on the 17th of December in a torrential rainstorm. Napoleon led from the front. His horse was shot out from under him, and an English corporal drove a lance into his leg. He kept going. Once the fort was taken, he turned its guns on the British ships and fired red-hot cannonballs into the harbour. 2 vessels exploded. The British evacuated, taking French royalists with them, and the Republican troops who flooded back into Toulon carried out reprisals that were savage even by the standards of the Terror. At 24 years old, Napoleon was promoted to brigadier general. His comrades took notice. Claude Victor described him as small in stature but well-proportioned, thin and puny in appearance, but taut and strong, with eyes that seemed to send out shafts of fire. The young general, exhausted and suffering from scabies he had picked up during the siege, accepted a quieter posting as inspector of coastal defences. He needed the rest. It did not last. When Robespierre fell, Napoleon's name was on the list. He spent 11 days under house arrest before being cleared and let go. He drifted to Marseille, where his brother Joseph had done well for himself, and there he met Desirée Clary, a modest 16-year-old. They became engaged. His letters to her read less like love notes and more like homework assignments, advice on what to read, how to practice her music. Ordered to the Army of the West to fight insurgents in the Vendée, Napoleon did what he could to avoid it. He traveled to Paris, obtained sick leave, and plunged into the hedonistic society of the capital. Wealthy women wore flesh-colored pantaloons and dresses of transparent gauze. Napoleon, with his unkempt hair and clumsy French, fit in about as well as a stray dog at a dinner party. The wife of his friend Borodino described him as cold, somber, and little short of savage. Feeling thoroughly out of place, he channeled his gloom into a novella, Clisson et Eugénie, about a misunderstood military genius who flees society, finds love with a pure young woman, and dies heroically. Around the same time, the War Ministry struck him off the list of artillery generals. He was put on half pay. He wrote to Joseph that he was very little attached to life. He floated the idea of throwing himself under a passing carriage. Then came October 1795, and with it a lifeline. Royalist sections of Paris rose against the government, and the politician Paul Barras needed someone who could act fast. He appointed Napoleon as his second-in-command to defend the Tuileries. Napoleon sent a young cavalry officer named Joachim Murat, galloping across the city to secure 40 cannons from the Sablons plain just ahead of the rebels. The guns were placed at key intersections, and then he waited. When the 20,000-strong rebel force advanced, Napoleon's artillery fired canister shot directly into their ranks. The insurrection was over within 2 hours. He was promoted to divisional general and given command of the Army of the Interior, which meant control of the capital's police and National Guard. He rode through the streets flanked by mustachioed officers, projecting a new and very deliberate authority. It was around this time that a 14-year-old boy came to ask permission to keep his executed father's sword. Napoleon granted it. The boy's mother arrived shortly after to give her thanks. Her name was Joséphine de Beauharnais. She was 32 years old, a widow of legendary charm, who had learned to smile without opening her mouth on account of her teeth. She lived on the generosity of her lovers and needed a husband to secure her future. Barras, her current patron, encouraged the match, partly to settle a young general who was becoming harder to manage. Napoleon fell hard. He wrote letters declaring that her kisses set his blood on fire. Josephine was cooler about it. She confided to a friend that she found his violent love resembled an excess of madness. Both parties forged their documents before signing the marriage contract. He added a couple of years. She shaved a few off. The civil ceremony happened late at night, conducted by a minor functionary. On the wedding night, Josephine's pet pug Fortune bit Napoleon in the calf as he climbed into bed. 2 days later, he was gone. He left Paris to take command of the Army of Italy, rattling south in his carriage as fast as the horses could carry him. "Every instant takes me further away from you, my adorable love," he wrote from somewhere along the road, "and with every instant I find less and less strength with which to bear being away from you." Ahead of him, on the Italian border, thousands of soldiers waited without boots, without pay, and without much reason to follow anyone. That was about to change. He arrived at the headquarters of the Army of Italy in March of 1796. He was 26 years old and looked every bit the outsider. The veteran commanders waiting for him were unimpressed. They saw a small, awkward young man with a rasping voice and a political appointment he had not earned on any battlefield they recognized. The army itself was in a terrible state. 40,000 soldiers, starving and mutinous, many of them wearing woven straw where boots should have been. Bonaparte did not ease himself in. He secured emergency funds, put fresh meat in front of the men, and demanded obedience. Then he moved, and he moved fast. He launched his forces through the mountains, driving a wedge between the Austrian and Sardinian armies before either could react. The French fought without tents or regular supply lines, living entirely off the land as they advanced. The Sardinians were intimidated into an armistice and forced out of the war altogether. Bonaparte then outflanked the retreating Austrians by crossing the River Po at Piacenza, pushing deep behind their lines. It was ruthless, improvisational, and it worked. At the town of Lodi, the French advance guard found the wooden bridge over the River Adda, defended by Austrian cannon. Bonaparte ordered a frontal assault. The first men who surged forward were cut apart by canister shot. Subsequent waves, led by senior officers who showed complete disregard for their own lives, managed to cross and dislodge the defenders. It was a skirmish, really, but Bonaparte exaggerated the scale of it in his reports and commissioned prints showing himself brandishing a standard amid the gunfire. He was learning something important about war, which was that the story you told afterwards mattered almost as much as the fight itself. Lodi changed something in him. He later reflected that it was only after that battle that it struck him he might become a major actor on the political scene. He rode into Milan on a white horse under arches of foliage, greeted by Italian nationalists who saw him as a liberator. Behind the pageantry, he stripped the conquered territories of cash, silver plate, and masterpieces of art, shipping it all back to Paris. That was how he funded the struggling Directory while quietly building a power base of his own. The Austrians were not finished. They launched counteroffensive after counteroffensive to relieve their besieged fortress at Mantua. Bonaparte defeated each one through rapid maneuver, marching his men to exhaustion across the theater of war. At Arcola, he tried to lead a charge across a heavily defended bridge. His men refused to follow. He ended up in a muddy drainage ditch, dragged to safety under enemy fire. The propaganda print that followed naturally showed him storming the bridge like a hero. After the decisive victory at Rivoli and the fall of Mantua, he marched on Vienna. Without consulting the Directory, he dictated the Treaty of Campo Formio, carving up the map of Europe on his own authority. He partitioned the neutral Republic of Venice, handing territory to Austria in exchange for French control of Belgium and the Rhineland. Paris was furious at his insubordination, but the peace was popular, and there was nothing they could do about it. Back in France, he kept a low profile for a time. He wore civilian clothes and attended meetings of the Institute of Arts and Sciences. He was already thinking about his next move. A direct invasion of Britain was impossible given the weakness of the French navy. So he proposed something far more ambitious, an expedition to Egypt. The idea was to establish a colony, cut British access to India, and eventually pierce the Isthmus of Suez with a canal. The Directory approved, happy enough to send their most dangerous general somewhere far away. The Armada captured Malta on its way and landed near Alexandria in July of 1798. What followed was brutal. The troops marched across scorching desert without water bottles. Men collapsed from dehydration and dysentery. Stragglers were killed by Mamluk horsemen. Some soldiers, delirious and despairing, took their own lives in the sand. At the Battle of the Pyramids, though, the French infantry formed disciplined squares and tore apart the Mamluk cavalry charges with volley after volley of musket fire. Bonaparte entered Cairo and began organizing the country, setting up hospitals, street lighting, and a new administration. A scientific commission investigated ancient ruins and Nile water purification. For a brief moment it looked like a colony might actually take shape. Then Admiral Nelson found the French fleet anchored at Abukir Bay and annihilated it. The army was trapped. An uprising in Cairo saw French soldiers massacred before being ruthlessly suppressed with artillery and beheadings. Bonaparte marched into Syria to confront an approaching Ottoman force. At Jaffa, his troops sacked the town. He ordered the execution of up to 2,000 prisoners of war on the beach because he had no food to spare for them. Bubonic plague struck the army. The siege of Acre failed, thwarted by Ottoman defenses and British naval guns. The retreat back to Egypt was a horror of abandoned, wounded, and dying men administered fatal doses of laudanum on Bonaparte's orders. He won one last battle, annihilating a seaborne Ottoman force at the land battle of Abukir and driving thousands of Turks into the sea. But word had reached him of French military defeats in Europe and a government teetering on the edge of collapse. He made his decision quickly. He left the army under General Kleber, boarded a frigate in secret with a handful of officers, and slipped through the British blockade. The soldiers he left behind would remain stranded in the Egyptian desert. Bonaparte was already gone, sailing for France, where a fragile and failing republic waited for someone to take hold of it. As the blue-eyed representatives of the people made their way down still dark streets on the morning of the 9th of November 1799, soldiers were already taking up positions around the Tuileries. Dragoons under Sebastiani, chasseurs under Murat. The system they were meant to be protecting had already collapsed under its own weight. The Directory, that five-headed government born of revolution, functioned as a hollow shell. Hyperinflation had wiped out ordinary savings. Army contractors and war profiteers built enormous fortunes off perpetual conflict, and a newly wealthy class of property owners was actively looking for a strong man, someone who could lock in their gains and crush any threat from the left or the right. Napoleon simply walked through a door that had been left wide open. Once the members of the Council of Elders had donned their togas and taken their seats, they were informed of a sinister plot by Jacobin brigands to bring down the government. The assemblies were in grave danger apparently and must transfer immediately to the former royal palace of St. Cloud outside Paris. To safeguard the move, they were told the hero of Egypt would take command of all troops in the region. Napoleon emerged from his study, read the decree aloud, called on those present to help him save the Republic, and then mounted a magnificent black horse lent to him by Admiral Bruix. He set off for the Tuileries, escorted by cavalry and a suite of generals in brilliant uniforms, cheered along the way by onlookers who had no idea what was actually happening. At about 10 o'clock he entered the chamber of the elders, flanked by Berthier and a handful of generals, and Eva rehearsed speech praising them for their wisdom. Then he went outside, climbed back onto the black horse which he was having some difficulty mastering, and made the rounds of the assembled units, exciting their enthusiasm with dramatic statements empty of substance. His agitation had brought out a severe rash on his face. While considering his next move, he scratched so hard he drew blood, which only seemed to confirm the rumor already flying through the ranks that he had been attacked with daggers. The story reached the crowd and eventually all the way to Paris. Inside the Council of 500, things were falling apart. His brother Lucien had done what he could to calm the shouting, but eventually made a histrionic gesture, removing his toga, his cap, and untying his gold-fringed sash, laying them down as a sign that liberty had been silenced. He ordered a captain to take 10 grenadiers and rescue him from the chamber. Then, in a piece of theatre that would have been absurd if it were not so effective, Lucien took a sword from an officer, put the point to his brother's breast, and solemnly swore he would kill Napoleon himself if he ever raised a finger against the liberty of the French people. As the drums beat the charge and grenadiers crashed into the oratory, some of the 500 climbed onto their benches and began swearing to defend the Republic. Others followed the spectators out through the conveniently low windows. Murat marched toward the podium and declared the assembly dissolved. Then, turning to his soldiers, he put it plainly, "Chuck this lot out of here." The next morning was a decade, a Republican Sunday. At 10 o'clock, Citizen Consul Bonaparte left home in civilian dress and was driven through empty streets to the Luxembourg in a carriage escorted by 6 dragoons. He went directly to Sieyes' apartment, where the two of them talked for over an hour. The first thing to be settled was who would preside over the new 3-man consulate. According to one version, Ducos simply turned to Napoleon and said, "It is quite unnecessary to vote on the presidency. It is yours by right." After Napoleon left the room, Sieyes reportedly told the others, "Gentlemen, you have a master. He wants to do everything, knows how to do everything, and can do everything." Napoleon moved from the Rue de la Victoire to the seat of power, establishing himself in rooms on the ground floor of the Petit Luxembourg, while Joséphine made herself at home on the floor above, and then he set to work. On the 13th of December, a 10-liter measuring jar was placed on the table in lieu of an urn, and the 50 members of 2 commissions wrote out their choices on slips of paper. Before the votes could be counted, Napoleon, who had been leaning on the mantelpiece warming his legs by the fire, strode over and snatched the jar. He emptied its contents into the flames. It was recorded that he and the others had been nominated by unanimous acclamation. On the 24th of December, aged 30 years and 4 months, he formally took office as first consul, dictating a proclamation to the nation, pledging to make the republic dear to its citizens, respectable to foreigners, and formidable to enemies. But a proclamation means nothing without a battlefield to back it up. And within months, one presented itself. At Marengo in June of 1800, he found himself facing the Austrian General Mellers, who had concentrated 30,000 men and 100 field guns near Alessandria. Napoleon was down to 22,000 with only 20 guns. "Come back in God's name if you still can," he wrote to Desaix. Desaix received the order at 1 o'clock and immediately set off, his men occasionally breaking into a run as they covered 13 kilometers to reach the field. By 3 in the afternoon, the battle appeared lost. Mellers, who had 2 painful falls from his horse that day at the age of 71, retired to Alessandria to lie down, leaving his generals to finish things off. Around 5 o'clock, Desaix arrived. After a brief exchange with Napoleon, he led his divisions into the fray. Simultaneously, General Kellerman gathered his cavalry and charged the Austrian flank. The entire French line surged forward. The Austrians faltered, fell back and fled. Desaix was killed leading the attack. "I feel the most profound grief at the death of the man I loved and esteemed the most," Napoleon wrote afterward. With the military crisis resolved, he turned to the machinery of the state itself. Napoleon did not understand or like the idea of government credit, which he saw as no more than betting on a favorable outcome. He liked hard currency and wanted to amass as much of it as possible. Gaudin, his finance minister, called in a friend named Nicolas Mullion, who explained to a bewildered Napoleon the workings of the stock market and the principle of a sinking fund. On the 13th of February, he established the Bank of France, handing the levers of state credit to a syndicate of private financiers whose interests were now permanently fused with the survival of the regime. Strikes were criminalized. Workers were bound to the livret, an employment passbook that subjected their movements and livelihoods to police control. The chaotic energy of the early revolution was eradicated, replaced by a rigid hierarchy enforced by Fauchet's security apparatus. On the 12th of August 1800, he appointed a commission of 4 jurists to draw up a civil code of laws, standardizing contracts, abolishing feudal obligations, and creating ironclad protections for private property. Over the next year, the Council of State devoted more than 100 sessions to it, at least 57 presided over by Napoleon, who stamped his own views on the final version. Those views were revealing. "Women need to be contained," he declared, explaining that they were naturally more flighty than men and liable to spend their husband's money like water. The husband must have the absolute power and right to say to his wife, "Madame, you will not go out. You will not go to the theatre. You will not see such and such a person." The code would not become law until March of 1804, when it would become known as the Code Napoleon. He drove the councillors like slaves. As one of them put it, one had to be made of iron to work with him. In 1800 alone, the Council of State dealt with 912 separate measures. It was not unusual for him to keep them at it for 8 or 10 hours with only a 15-minute break for lunch. "Come, come, citizens, wake up," he would say when he saw them flagging past midnight. "It is only 2 o'clock, and we must earn the money which the people of France give us." He would toy with his snuff-box while he listened, opening and shutting the lid, taking a pinch, most of which fell on the white facings of his uniform. Without looking, he would pass the box to an aide behind his chair, who would hand him another. To help himself think, he would produce a penknife and belabor the arm of his chair with it. The cabinet maker replaced it regularly. He might wake at 1 or 4 in the morning, summon his secretary, and begin dictating in a white dressing gown with a scarf wrapped about his head. He hardly ever wrote himself, partly because his hand could not keep up with his thoughts, partly because neither he nor anyone else could read his handwriting. He might pause for ice cream or something more substantial, and then pick up exactly where he had left off. And so the machinery of the French state was rebuilt, piece by piece, in marathon sessions and pre-dawn dictations. The consul had secured his grip on power. The armies that had carried him there still waited, hundreds of thousands of men in camps and garrisons across the country. Beyond the borders, the old powers of Europe watched with growing unease. The world Napoleon had forced into being was too new, too volatile to sit quietly for long. To understand the wars that Napoleon would fight, we need to step back from the man himself, because the world he stepped into was already a volatile place, shaped by decades of rivalry between a handful of powerful states. 5 nations dominated European politics by the late 1700s: Britain, France, Austria, Prussia, and Russia. Between them, they decided the fate of continents. And when diplomacy failed, as it often did, war became the final word. Britain held the seas. Its Royal Navy commanded more than double the warships of the French fleet, which gave it an extraordinary advantage. The French could not train their sailors properly, could not access naval supplies freely, and found their military resources pinned down on the continent. After the 7 Years' War, which ended in 1763, Britain had cemented its dominance over global trade and colonial territory, largely at the expense of France and Spain. It was a maritime empire with no real challenger on the water. On land, the picture was messier. Prussia had clawed its way into the ranks of the great powers only a generation before, winning 2 major wars despite long odds. But it was a fragile kind of greatness. The kingdom was small, its population modest, and it taxed its people heavily just to keep up appearances. Austria, meanwhile, had long dominated Central Europe through the Holy Roman Empire, but it lacked the ethnic and linguistic unity of its neighbors. It was a patchwork held together by tradition and dynastic marriages, and it knew how vulnerable that made it. Then there was Russia, which had expanded with breathtaking speed in the second half of the century. No other European state had gained so much territory so quickly. In 1772, Catherine the Great engineered the first partition of Poland, swallowing up vast tracts of the Eastern Kingdom and placing her preferred candidate on the Polish throne. A few years later, victory in the Russo-Turkish War brought Russian control to the northern coastline of the Black Sea. And by 1783, the Treaty of Georgievsky had extended Russia's military presence across the Caucasus Mountains into eastern Georgia. Russia was hungry, and it was growing. These rivalries were not limited to Europe. The Nootka Sound crisis of 1789 showed just how far the competition had spread. Spain had claimed the Pacific coast of North America since the 1500s and tolerated no foreign presence in those waters. But when British ships appeared near Vancouver Island, the Spanish Navy seized them, imprisoned the crews, and declared exclusive sovereignty over the entire coastline. For a moment, it looked like war. In the end, Spain backed down and agreed to let the British trade and settle in unoccupied areas above San Francisco. A small diplomatic episode, perhaps, but it revealed something important. European powers were now staking claims across the globe, and any one of those claims could ignite a wider conflict. India was another flashpoint. The British East India Company had been tightening its grip on the subcontinent for decades, but its position was far from secure. Powerful regional states like the Maratha Confederation and the Dominion of Hyderabad controlled vast territories, and to the south, the Kingdom of Mysore under Tipu Sultan had been a persistent thorn. Tipu had welcomed French Republican envoys, planted a tree of liberty at his capital of Seringapatam, and made overtures to French forces in Mauritius. For the British, this was alarming. In the spring of 1799, Richard Wellesley, the Governor-General, went to war. The Fourth Mysore War was short and brutal. British forces stormed Seringapatam on the 4th of May, and Tipu Sultan was killed in the fighting. Wellesley then turned his attention to the Marathas, negotiating the Treaty of Bassein, which brought the Maratha leadership under British influence in exchange for military protection. India was being reshaped piece by piece. The revolution had already upended Napoleon's life, as we have seen, but it had also upended the entire European order. The execution of King Louis XVI in January 1793 horrified the continent's monarchies, and the National Convention's so-called Edict of Fraternity made things worse, promising assistance to any people who wished to overthrow their rulers. The British Prime Minister put it plainly. "We are not at war with the opinions of the closet," he said. "We are at war with armed opinions." By the spring of 1793, most of Europe had joined the first coalition against France. The early campaigns went badly for the French. Austro-Prussian forces invaded and pushed toward Paris. The Allies issued the Brunswick Manifesto, threatening to level the capital if the royal family was harmed. It was meant to intimidate. Instead, it enraged the population. And at Valmy in September 1792, French gunners held their ground against Prussian veterans, refusing to be silenced. General Kellerman raised his hat and cried, "Vive la nation!" The words swept through the ranks. It was a modest battle in military terms, but a seismic one in spirit. From that moment, the revolution mobilized on a scale Europe had never seen. The Committee of Public Safety launched the levée en masse, calling on every citizen to serve. From this moment until the enemy shall have been driven from the soil of the Republic, declared the National Convention, all Frenchmen are in permanent requisition for the service of the armies. Within a year, 14 new armies had been raised. Some 800,000 men were under arms. Prussia, exhausted, signed the Treaty of Basel in 1795 and withdrew from the war, recognizing French control of the left bank of the Rhine. Historians have called that treaty a death certificate for the Holy Roman Empire, since Prussia chose its own national interest over the old imperial order. And Poland, partitioned a third and final time, was erased from the map entirely. The old chessboard of European diplomacy had been upended. Traditional alliances fractured, colonial possessions changed hands, and the sheer scale of French mobilization left every neighboring power scrambling to respond. The exhaustion was mutual. Years of continuous warfare stretching from the Rhine to the Indian Ocean had drained treasuries and armies alike. A pause was coming, a fragile diplomatic intermission. But it would not hold for long. For the first time in nearly a decade, the guns across continental Europe fell silent. The Peace of Lunaville, signed in early 1801, had done what many thought impossible. Austria, humiliated and exhausted, gave up the territorial gains it had won in Italy just 4 years earlier. The treaty recognized a constellation of new republics, Swiss, Dutch, Genoese, Lombard, each one a French dependency in all but name. Bonaparte had, through force and negotiation, redrawn the map, and he was not finished. In July of that year, he concluded a concordat with the papacy, mending a rift that had torn through French society since the Revolution. The government of the Republic acknowledges that the Catholic, Apostolic, and Roman religion is the religion of the great majority of French citizens, read the opening lines. It was a striking gesture from a man who had little personal use for religion. Church dioceses were reorganized, parishes restructured, and buried within the agreement was perhaps its most consequential provision. The Roman Catholic Church formally surrendered all claims to the lands that had been confiscated and nationalized since 1790. A decade of seizures made permanent with the stroke of a pen. Then came the peace with Britain. On the 25th of March 1802, France and Britain signed the Treaty of Amiens, ending almost 2 years of careful, grinding negotiation. Bonaparte's brother Joseph had handled the French side and raced to Paris with the signed document. He arrived during a theatre performance, which was duly interrupted so Bonaparte could present his brother to a cheering audience. Across the English Channel, mail coaches carried the news with the words "Peace with France" chalked on their sides. They were met with celebrations in towns across the country, crowds shouting approval for the French leader by name. George III renounced his title of King of France, a holdover from the 100 Years' War that his predecessors had clung to for centuries. Britain agreed to return captured French colonies and those of her allies, keeping only Ceylon and Trinidad. France in turn accepted the return of Egypt to the Ottoman Porte and the Papal States to the Pope. Malta was to go back to the Order of St. John under the protection of Naples. It was tidy, comprehensive, and doomed. Even as the ink dried, Bonaparte was looking westward. He dispatched a massive expeditionary force to Saint-Domingue, modern-day Haiti, which had been in open rebellion since the early 1790s under the leadership of Toussaint Louverture. The force was commanded by Bonaparte's own brother-in-law, Charles Leclerc, and it was one of the largest overseas military operations any European power had attempted in that age. They arrived in January 1802. Some local commanders defected to the French, but Louverture called on the entire population to resist, then withdrew into the interior. The fighting was savage. Deprived of water and food in the overwhelming heat, one eyewitness wrote, the troops had to chew on balls of lead in the hope of quenching their unbearable thirst. In early June, Louverture was lured into a trap and captured. He was shipped to France and locked away in solitary confinement at Fort de Joux. William Wordsworth would later describe him as the most unhappy man of men. He died less than a year after his imprisonment. More than 50,000 French soldiers, sailors, and civilians perished in the campaign, alongside a far greater number of black troops and civilians. The disaster in the Caribbean had consequences that rippled across an ocean. In 1803, Bonaparte surprised American negotiators by offering the entire Louisiana territory, over 800,000 square miles, for $15 million. The money was handled through a Dutch banking house in Amsterdam and a British one in London, who sold the stock and transferred the cash to France. The final transfer came on the 20th of December 1803. Bonaparte had cut his losses in the Americas and turned his attention back to Europe, where the fragile peace was already coming apart. Britain refused to recognize the new Italian republics, viewing them as threats to the balance of power on the continent. British newspapers portrayed Bonaparte as a yellow-skinned pygmy, a monstrous hybrid. One tabloid called him an unclassifiable being, half African, half European, a Mediterranean mulatto. His wife, Josephine, was portrayed as a harlot. His stepdaughter Hortense was accused of incest. The French government retaliated by confiscating British goods, banning their importation across French-controlled territories, and ordering the imprisonment of any British subjects found within reach. Bonaparte launched massive naval construction, urging his ministry to build as many vessels as possible. Money, he said, was no object. By 1804, he expected to have more than 1,600 flat-bottomed invasion boats, supported by another 1,000 fishing vessels converted into transports. The Peace of Amiens had lasted just 420 days. Its collapse unleashed 12 years of war and misery that would shape the destinies of Europe and the wider world. Meanwhile, the man at the center of it all had been quietly consolidating. He secured the consulship for life in August 1802, along with the right to name his own successor. Officers attended his person. Honors were paid to the women of his household. A privileged family surrounded him in ceremony. Everything, observers noted, was monarchical, everything except the title of consul. And that name, too, was destined soon to disappear. By the autumn of 1804, he had survived more assassination attempts than most men would care to count. Royalist conspirators, Jacobin holdouts, even a bomb that had torn apart a Parisian street and killed bystanders. The question of succession had become impossible to ignore. If he died without an heir, without a dynasty, the whole enterprise would collapse overnight. And so the decision was made. France would have an emperor. The coronation was set for the 2nd of December at Notre Dame Cathedral. Months of preparation went into transforming the Gothic interior into something closer to ancient Rome. The architect Fontaine oversaw the construction of enormous wooden grandstands, draped the walls in silk, and filled the space with thousands of wax candles. Pope Pius VII had been persuaded, or perhaps pressured is the fairer word, to make the long journey across the Alps in freezing late autumn weather. He arrived in Paris exhausted and was promptly subjected to days of calculated diplomatic slights designed to make one thing clear. The Pope was here to bless the occasion. He was not here to run it. On the day itself, the procession to the cathedral stretched through the streets of Paris. Thousands of soldiers lined the route. 80 carriages rolled past the crowds. The imperial carriage was drawn by 8 dun-colored horses and covered in gold leaf. Josephine wore white satin embroidered in gold and silver. He wore a heavy crimson velvet mantle lined with ermine and covered in golden bees, a deliberate replacement for the old Bourbon fleur-de-lis. And when the moment came for the crowning, he did something that no one in the cathedral would forget. He took the laurel wreath of gold from the altar himself. He placed it on his own head. Then he turned and crowned Josephine, who knelt before him in tears. The message was plain enough. He owed his throne to no one. With the spectacle behind him, his attention turned entirely to the coast. 150,000 veterans of the Revolutionary Wars were camped around Boulogne, living in rows of organized wooden huts, drilling day after day, staring across the channel at the British shoreline. They were waiting for naval control of the crossing. It never came. At Trafalgar, Horatio Nelson destroyed the combined Franco-Spanish fleet, and with it any serious hope of invading Britain. The army at Boulogne was immediately renamed the Grande Armée, ordered to break camp, and sent marching east to meet a new threat. Austria and Russia had formed the Third Coalition. The speed of what followed was extraordinary. 7 columns of troops crossed the Rhine simultaneously, each operating independently but converging on a single objective. They covered up to 30 kilometers a day, carrying their own ammunition and rations, living off the land to avoid the slow supply trains that weighed down traditional armies. The Austrian commander, General Karl Mack, had positioned his forces at the fortress of expecting the French to come through the Black Forest. They swung far to the north instead, looped around behind him, and cut off every route of escape. On the 20th of October 1805, Mack surrendered 27,000 men, 60 cannons, and all his colors without a major battle having been fought. Napoleon addressed his troops afterward. "Soldiers of the Grand Armée, I have destroyed the Austrian army by simply marching." The French then pushed east along the Danube, taking Vienna with barely a fight after Marshal Lannes talked his way across the main bridge by convincing the Austrian defenders that an armistice had already been signed. It had not. The decisive moment came at Austerlitz on the 2nd of December, exactly 1 year to the day after the coronation. Napoleon had deliberately weakened his right flank, baiting the combined Austro-Russian army into descending from the high ground of the Pratzen Heights. It was a trap, and it depended entirely on precise timing and the arrival of Marshal Davout's corps after a forced march from Vienna. As heavy morning fog lifted, sunlight broke across the field. Marshal Soult's men charged up the now exposed heights and split the coalition army clean in two. Thousands of Russian soldiers tried to flee across the frozen Sachin ponds. French artillery fired into the ice and shattered it beneath them. Austerlitz ended the Third Coalition. Austria signed the punitive Treaty of Pressburg, losing vast territories and paying a crushing indemnity. The 1,000-year-old Holy Roman Empire was formally dissolved, replaced by the Confederation of the Rhine, a string of German client states built to serve French interests. Prussia, which had stayed neutral during all of this, now belatedly declared war, furious at territorial violations and urged on by the fiercely anti-French Queen Louise. The Prussian army marched into Thuringia with confidence and the outdated tactics of Frederick the Great. On the 14th of October 1806, at the twin battles of Jena and Auerstedt, that confidence was destroyed. Napoleon crushed what he believed was the main Prussian force at Jena. Meanwhile, Marshal Davout's isolated corps of 26,000 men ran into the actual main army of 63,000 and systematically broke it apart. The pursuit that followed was relentless. Within weeks, French troops had taken Berlin and paraded through the Brandenburg Gate. What remained of the Prussian forces retreated into Poland to link up with the Russians, dragging the war into the freezing mud of Eastern Europe. The winter campaign that followed was brutal. At Eylau in February of 1807, the two armies fought in a blinding snowstorm. Men froze to death standing upright. Marshal Augereau's entire corps lost its bearings in the blizzard and stumbled directly into Russian artillery. A massive cavalry charge led by Marshal Murat was the only thing that saved the French center from collapsing entirely. Over 40,000 casualties were left bleeding in the snow. It was a stalemate, and it shook morale badly. The decisive victory only came months later at Friedland in June, where the French caught the Russian army pinned against the River Arlay and tore it apart with massed artillery at close range. And then came Tilsit. A raft was built and moored in the middle of the River Neman. Napoleon and Tsar Alexander I met on it, embraced in front of their cheering armies, and sat down to divide Europe between them. The Tsar reportedly opened by saying, "I hate the English as much as you do." Napoleon replied, "If that is the case, peace is made." The continent now had two masters. But the sea still belonged to Britain, and no treaty signed on a river raft could change that. The French navy was gone. A direct strike on London was physically impossible. If Britain was going to be brought to its knees, it would have to be done another way entirely. On the 21st of November 1806, Napoleon issued the Berlin Decree. It declared the British Isles to be in a state of blockade. No country under French influence was permitted to trade with Britain, receive British ships, or even correspond with British merchants. Any British goods found on the continent were to be seized and destroyed. The idea, which came to be known as the Continental System, was blunt in its logic. Britain's military strength rested on its wealth. Its wealth came from trade. Cut off the trade and the wealth would dry up, and with it the ability to fund coalition after coalition against France. There was a problem with this logic, and it was a serious one. Britain was in the middle of an industrial revolution. Its factories were multiplying output at a pace that no continental economy could match. Its financial institutions ran deep. The Bank of England, the insurance networks at Lloyd's, the capital markets of London. These were not just wealthy, they were structurally resilient, designed to absorb shocks and keep functioning. France had nothing like them. Napoleon was trying to strangle an economy that was in many respects stronger than his own. The British hit back almost immediately. The government issued the Orders in Council, which forbade neutral ships from entering French-controlled ports unless they first stopped in Britain and paid a transit duty. Napoleon countered with the Milan Decree the following year, declaring that any neutral vessel that submitted to British inspection would be treated as an enemy ship and seized on sight. The result was a kind of legal trap. A merchant captain sailing across the Atlantic could not obey one side without breaking the rules of the other. Neutral nations, the United States chief among them, found their shipping fleets caught in the middle. The tensions that built from this impossible situation would eventually spill over into the War of 1812. Across Europe, the effects of the blockade rippled outward in strange and uneven ways. Colonial goods vanished from the markets almost overnight. There was no more cane sugar, no coffee, no cheap cotton. Farmers in northern Europe began cultivating sugar beets on a massive scale. Roasted chicory root became a common substitute for coffee, though by most accounts a deeply unsatisfying one. In landlocked regions like Saxony, Belgium, and parts of eastern France, textile manufacturers found themselves suddenly free of British competition. The removal of cheap, high-quality imports created a captive market, and for a time profits soared. But the great port cities told a very different story. Amsterdam, Hamburg, Bordeaux. These were places that had lived and breathed international trade for centuries. The sudden halt of maritime commerce devastated them. Merchants went bankrupt, dock workers lost their livelihoods, and the inland textile boom did not last either, because without raw cotton imports arriving by sea, the factories that had been thriving began to starve for materials. Thousands of weavers were left unemployed in the very regions the system was supposed to protect. Enforcing all of this required an enormous bureaucratic apparatus. French customs officers patrolled the coastline from the Baltic to the Adriatic, conducting raids on merchant warehouses and dragging confiscated British goods into public squares where they were piled high and set on fire. The bonfires were meant as a warning. They were also an admission that the goods kept getting through. The coastline was simply too long, the borders too porous, and the profits of smuggling too enormous to resist. Entire fishing communities along the coast abandoned their nets and turned to the black market. Contraband moved in false-bottomed boats, on carts pulled by dogs, through night landings on remote beaches. The British occupied the tiny island of Heligoland in the North Sea and turned it into a floating warehouse, a massive smuggling depot just off the German coast where thousands of vessels transferred textiles, spices, and weapons to local runners who filtered everything inland through the river networks. Corruption among French officials was widespread. Commanders posted to remote hostile stretches of coastline were underpaid and far from home. Many accepted bribes to look the other way. In Hamburg, the diplomat Louis de Berrien amassed a personal fortune by simply charging his own illegal tariff on British goods passing through the port. The deeper flaw was this: Europe needed British goods more than Britain needed the European market. Denied access to the continent, British merchants expanded aggressively into South America and Asia. Their overall export revenues actually increased. Meanwhile, the prices of basic commodities across Europe climbed steadily, wages stagnated, and ordinary people bore the weight of an embargo that enriched only a narrow band of French-aligned industrialists and black market operators. Resentment toward French rule grew quietly at first, then not so quietly. Former allies began to feel like subjects, and the desperation for hard currency eventually pushed the French government to issue special licenses, allowing select merchants to trade directly with Britain, a blatant violation of its own system that enraged partners like Russia and Prussia, who were suffering immense economic damage to enforce a blockade that France itself was breaking for profit. To keep the system from collapsing, Napoleon was forced to keep expanding. Whenever a coastal territory failed to suppress smuggling, French troops marched in. The Kingdom of Holland was annexed. So were the Hanseatic cities of Bremen and Hamburg. So were the Papal States. Each annexation stretched the empire thinner, demanded more soldiers, more administrators, more money. And it was this very logic, this relentless need to seal every harbor and control every dock, that now turned French attention southward toward the Iberian Peninsula, where the ports of Portugal remained stubbornly open to British trade. It began, as these things often do, with a plan drawn up in secret. The Treaty of Fontainebleau, signed behind closed doors, carved Portugal into pieces between France and Spain before anyone in Lisbon had the faintest idea what was coming. On paper, it looked clean. A quick march, a swift occupation, and Portugal would fall neatly into the continental system. The emperor would have his coastline sealed, Britain would lose another trading partner, and General Jean Andoche Junot was the man tasked with making it happen. Junot's march south was brutal from the start. His army was thrown together in haste, filled with raw conscripts who had barely learned to hold a musket. They crossed the barren interior of Spain in freezing autumn rain, the roads turning to mud beneath their boots. Food ran out. Horses collapsed. Artillery pieces were abandoned where they sank into the earth because there was no way to pull them free. By the time the column reached Lisbon, the soldiers looked less like an invading army and more like refugees. Many were barefoot. Most were starving. They could barely have fought a tavern brawl, let alone a battle. And they were too late. Just hours before Junot's bedraggled troops stumbled onto the Lisbon docks, the entire Braganza royal family had boarded their ships. The state treasury went with them. So did the Portuguese fleet. They sailed for Brazil under British naval escort, and Junot could do nothing but stand on the quayside and watch. The prize had slipped away across the Atlantic. Still, French boots were now on Iberian soil, and there was no intention of removing them. In Spain, a vicious family quarrel had been tearing the royal household apart for months. King Charles IV, weak-willed and dominated by his deeply unpopular minister Manuel Godoy, found himself locked in a power struggle with his own son, Ferdinand. The conflict boiled over in the mutiny of Aranjuez, a violent upheaval that forced Charles to abdicate. Ferdinand seized the throne. The country was in chaos. And into that chaos the emperor saw an opportunity. He summoned both father and son to the French city of Bayonne under the pretense of mediating their dispute. It was a trap, of course. Once the two men were isolated on French soil, he subjected them to a campaign of intimidation. He made no effort to disguise his contempt. "They are the most wretched family in existence," he reportedly said. By the time it was over, both Charles and Ferdinand had renounced their claims to the Spanish throne entirely. The Bourbons were finished. In their place, the emperor installed his older brother, Joseph Bonaparte, as king in Madrid. He assumed the Spanish people would welcome it. A fresh start, a modern administration, an end to the corruption of the old regime. It was a spectacular miscalculation. Spain was a country of 10.5 million people, and woven through every village and valley was the Catholic Church, a vast institution that functioned almost as a parallel state, 200,000 clergy, 2,000 monasteries. The Church owned enormous tracts of land, ran schools, administered welfare, and held a kind of moral authority over rural life that no foreign power could hope to replicate. When Joseph's new government moved almost immediately to suppress 2/3 of the country's convents and monasteries, the reaction was ferocious. For millions of ordinary Spaniards, this was an attack on the fabric of their world. Geography worked against the French, too. In places like the Low Countries or northern Italy, the occupation had been relatively straightforward. Those regions were urbanized with established municipal bureaucracies and a commercial class willing to cooperate. Spain was different. The population was overwhelmingly rural and scattered across vast distances, governed by a landed nobility that had little dependence on urban supply chains. There was no centralized administrative machinery in the countryside for the French to seize hold of. They could take cities, but they could not take Spain. The spark came on the 2nd of May, 1808, the Dos de Mayo. French troops in Madrid attempted to escort the last remaining members of the royal family out of the city, and the people of the capital simply snapped. Citizens attacked the French with paving stones, kitchen knives, boiling water, whatever they could lay their hands on. A street battle erupted that left hundreds dead. Marshal Murat, commanding the garrison, responded with a savagery calculated to terrify. He unleashed the Mamluk cavalry of the Imperial Guard, who rode through the civilian crowds, cutting people down in the streets. The next morning, French firing squads lined up hundreds of captured insurgents on the Principe Pio hill and shot them. Francisco Goya would later paint those executions, and his images remain among the most harrowing depictions of war ever committed to canvas. News of the massacre spread fast across the provinces. Uprisings broke out, organized by local juntas, regional councils that drew their authority from existing power structures. The local nobility rallied their tenants. The clergy rallied their congregations. But even in their shared hatred of the French, these councils were divided. Reactionary factions, the serviles, fought to preserve aristocratic and clerical privilege. Liberal factions, the liberales, saw the crisis as a chance to push for constitutional reform, legal equality, an end to the old feudal order. The two sides needed each other to fight the war. They also despised each other. This contradiction would hamper the resistance for years and sow chaos long after the last French soldier had left. In July of 1808, the myth of French invincibility died in the plains of Andalusia. At the Battle of Bayonne, General Pierre Dupont found his army exhausted, dehydrated, and completely surrounded by Spanish regulars and armed peasants. He surrendered his entire corps. 18,000 men laid down their weapons. It was an unprecedented humiliation, and the news sent shock waves across every occupied nation in Europe. If the French could be beaten in open battle, then perhaps the war could be won. Britain moved quickly. An expeditionary force landed in Portugal under the command of Arthur Wellesley, a methodical, sharp-eyed officer who understood defensive warfare the way a watchmaker understands gears. At Vimeiro, he repelled Junot's frontal assaults with carefully timed volleys of infantry musketry. It was precise, economical, devastating. And it was a preview of the kind of fighting that would define the British campaigns in the peninsula for years to come. What followed was a guerrilla war, the term itself literally meaning little war, and it bled the French occupation white. Over the next 5 years out in the countryside, French taxation, forced conscription, and aggressive requisitioning drove the peasantry into the mountains. These Spanish partisans knew every ridge and ravine. They ambushed supply convoys, assassinated isolated couriers, and vanished back into terrain the French could not hope to navigate. The result was that the occupation only ever controlled the ground directly beneath its soldiers' feet. Step off the main road, and you were in enemy territory. The violence escalated beyond anything resembling conventional warfare. Both sides abandoned the old rules entirely. French soldiers burned villages, assaulted the inhabitants, executed clergy. Spanish guerrillas tortured captured Frenchmen, boiling them alive, burying them to the neck in the dirt, nailing them to trees along the rural highways. Each atrocity justified the next, a grinding cycle of cruelty that consumed the countryside. To protect his vital base in Lisbon, Wellesley constructed the lines of Torres Vedras, a vast network of forts, redoubts, and trenches stretching from the Atlantic coast to the Tagus River. When Marshal Massena advanced into Portugal with a French army, he hit this wall and could go no further. The countryside behind the lines had been deliberately stripped bare. Massena's men found nothing to eat, nothing to forage. They starved in the desolate landscape for weeks before pulling back in a disastrous retreat. At its height, over 250,000 French soldiers were pinned down across Spain. They chased a phantom enemy through the mountains, an enemy they could wound but never kill. And all the while, Wellesley's Anglo-Portuguese regulars operated from their secure coastal supply base, striking when the moment was right, withdrawing when it was not. The peninsula became an open wound in the side of the empire, one that would never heal. And while those hundreds of thousands of soldiers bled and starved across the Iberian interior, the ripples of the crisis were traveling outward far beyond Europe. The collapse of traditional trade routes and the sheer absorption of military attention on the continent had created an enormous vacuum at the edges of the established order. Ancient empires in the Middle East began to fracture. Colonial authorities in the Americas sensed that the grip of their European masters was loosening. The global order, already strained to breaking, was about to be renegotiated violently by powers that had been waiting for exactly this kind of opportunity. While the great powers of Europe battered one another across familiar ground, the tremors of their conflict reached far beyond the continent, across oceans and mountain ranges, into places most Europeans could barely find on a map. The wars remade entire civilizations. And it is to those distant fronts that we turn now, where the consequences were every bit as dramatic and often a good deal bloodier. In Istanbul, the Ottoman Sultan Selim III had watched the rise of European military power with growing alarm. His response was a sweeping reform program called the Nizam Letter 131 Sedid, which aimed to drag the Ottoman army into the modern age. New infantry units were raised, dressed in European-style uniforms and drilled to Western commands. They bypassed the old military hierarchy entirely. And the Janissaries, that ancient warrior class who held enormous political and social influence, saw the whole thing as a betrayal of tradition, of their status, of Islam itself. In May of 1807, auxiliaries known as the Yamaks mutinied along the Bosphorus. The Janissaries and the conservative clerics rallied behind them almost immediately. They marched on the Topkapi Palace demanding the heads of the reformist ministers. Selim was deposed, locked away in the royal cages, and eventually murdered by his own cousins to make sure he could never reclaim the throne. Meanwhile, the Ottoman Empire was fighting a grinding war against Russia across the Danubian principalities and the rugged Caucasus. Russian forces under Mikhail Kutuzov achieved a decisive encirclement at the Battle of Slobozia. The Treaty of Bucharest, signed in 1812, forced the Ottomans to hand over Bessarabia. For Russia, the timing was fortunate. It secured their southern flank just as Napoleon's army was preparing to cross the Neman River. Further south in Serbia, a fierce local rebellion had erupted against the Dahij, corrupt Janissary commanders who had murdered prominent Serbian nobles. The uprising was led by Karađorđe, a wealthy pig trader with no patience for diplomacy. What began as a localized revolt quickly became a full-scale war for independence, a sign of how badly Ottoman authority had frayed across its European provinces. Deep in the Caucasus, Russia was expanding aggressively, annexing Georgian kingdoms and clashing with the Qajar dynasty of Iran. Fath Ali Shah, desperate for a European ally, turned to France. The Treaty of Finkenstein in 1807 promised French military aid and the return of lost territories in exchange for Iranian support against British India. A French military mission under General Gardain duly arrived in Tehran, setting up cannon foundries and drilling Iranian soldiers in modern tactics. It all evaporated the moment the Treaty of Tilsit was signed. France abandoned its Iranian partners overnight to appease Russia. British diplomats moved in immediately. Sir John Malcolm and Sir Harford Jones arrived with generous financial subsidies, modern firearms, and experienced military advisors. Even so, Iranian forces suffered a crushing defeat at Aslanduz. The Treaty of Gulistan in 1813 forced Iran to permanently cede its Caucasian territories to Russia. It was a pattern that played out again and again across the globe during these years. One alliance collapsed, another filled the gap, and the people caught in the middle paid the price. Britain, for its part, was busy dismantling the overseas colonies of every rival it could reach. In 1806, a heavily armed fleet arrived off the Dutch Cape Colony in South Africa. British infantry defeated the Dutch defenders at Blouberg, securing the vital sea route to the Indian Ocean. That same year, acting entirely without official authorization, Commodore Sir Home Popham sailed across the Atlantic and captured Buenos Aires, physically seizing the colonial treasury. The local Spanish authorities fled, leaving the city's defense to ordinary citizens. Those citizens organized a massive urban militia under Santiago de Liniers. They fought the British occupation in fierce street-to-street combat, pouring boiling water from the flat rooftops and dropping heavy paving stones onto the soldiers below. The British commander, William Beresford, was forced into unconditional surrender. A revenge expedition under General Whitelock arrived the following year and fared even worse. He ordered his men to march down narrow streets without firing, straight into fortified barricades. The casualties were catastrophic. Whitelock signed a total capitulation and evacuated the region entirely. In the Indian Ocean, French privateers operating from the Mascarene Islands were bleeding British commercial shipping dry. Lord Minto, the Governor-General of India, launched an amphibious invasion in 1810. British and Indian sepoys overwhelmed the French garrison on Isle de France, renamed the island Mauritius, and turned their attention to the Dutch East Indies. The following year, a massive armada landed on Java. British forces stormed the fortified Dutch encampment at Meester Cornelis in brutal hand-to-hand fighting. The capture of Java cemented British dominance across the entire Eastern Hemisphere. And then there was Spain's collapsing empire in the Americas. When Madrid fell into political chaos, local elites across the colonies refused to recognize Joseph Bonaparte. Independent juntas sprang up in Caracas, Buenos Aires, and Bogotá. What started as movements loyal to the deposed Ferdinand VII soon radicalized into full wars of independence. In Mexico, the radical priest Miguel Hidalgo issued the Grito de Dolores in September of 1810, triggering a massive peasant uprising. Tens of thousands of indigenous and mestizo insurgents marched on Mexico City armed with machetes and farming tools. In South America, Simón Bolívar launched his legendary Admirable campaign, crossing the freezing Andes to liberate Venezuela. He declared a war to the death, decreeing that any Spaniard who did not actively support independence would be executed. These were not sideshows. The decisions made in the palaces of Paris and London dictated the survival of ancient dynasties in Tehran, the shifting borders of the Balkans, the control of the Javanese spice trade, and the violent emergence of new republics across the Western Hemisphere. The wealth extracted from all of these far-flung territories poured back into the British war machine, funding the subsidies that kept France's enemies armed and fighting. And for every French victory on the continent, that ocean of foreign capital ensured it remained temporary, forcing Paris to demand ever more from an already exhausted population. By 1809, the strain of holding an empire together by force of will and cannon fire had begun to show. Austria, humiliated in previous wars and stripped of territory, had spent the intervening years quietly rebuilding. Archduke Charles modernized the army from top to bottom, adopting the French corps system, expanding his artillery, and stoking something new among his soldiers, a genuine sense of German national pride. When the moment came, the Austrians struck hard and fast, pouring troops into Bavaria while the bulk of France's veteran forces were tangled up fighting guerrillas across Spain. The army that scrambled to respond was a changed thing. Teenage conscripts filled its ranks alongside vast contingents of Allied troops drawn from the Confederation of the Rhine. These were capable soldiers, many of them. But the force that had swept across Europe just a few years earlier had been reshaped in ways that would matter on the battlefield. And it showed. In the Tyrolean Alps, a spontaneous uprising erupted against the French-backed Bavarian authorities. It was led by an innkeeper named Andreas Hofer, a charismatic figure who rallied deeply conservative mountain communities. Enraged by secular French laws and Bavarian conscription quotas, the Tyroleans fought with devastating improvisation. They ambushed columns in narrow alpine passes, sending boulders and timber crashing down cliff faces onto the soldiers trapped below. It was ugly, effective, and impossible to stamp out quickly. Meanwhile, the main French army pushed east along the Danube Valley and captured Vienna for the second time in 4 years. The city offered little resistance, but crossing the river proved far more dangerous than taking the capital. Hastily built pontoon bridges carried the French vanguard to the northern bank near the villages of Aspern and Essling. Then the Austrians sent heavy barges loaded with stones downstream to smash the bridges apart, stranding the advanced force against the water with no way back. What followed was the first major personal defeat of the emperor's career. For 2 full days, French infantry fought house to house under point-blank artillery fire. When they finally withdrew back across the river, they left behind thousands of dead and wounded. Among the casualties was Marshal Lannes, one of Napoleon's oldest companions. A cannonball shattered both his legs, and he died days later in agonizing delirium. The loss hit the high command hard. The French retreated to the island of Lobo, sitting in the middle of the Danube, and spent 6 weeks turning it into a fortified staging ground. Engineers drove bridge supports deep into the riverbed, building crossings sturdy enough to carry the entire army at once. There would be no repeat of the disaster at Aspern. The Battle of Wagram, fought in July of that year, involved over 300,000 men. It was the largest engagement in European history up to that point. The French deployed a grand battery of more than 100 cannons, hammering the Austrian center with continuous fire that blanketed the plains in choking smoke. To break the line, General MacDonald formed 8,000 men into a colossal hollow square and marched them straight into a crossfire of canister shot. The formation was torn to pieces. Bodies piled thick along the path of advance, but the sheer weight of the column punched through, and the Austrians fell back. The peace that followed was punishing. Austria lost 3 million subjects, paid an enormous indemnity, and surrendered all access to the Adriatic Sea. The harshness of it guaranteed that Austrian resentment would fester and that Vienna would rejoin any coalition the instant French power looked vulnerable. The bloodshed at Aspern-Essling, combined with assassination plots back in Paris, had sharpened one question in Napoleon's mind. He needed an heir. The decision to divorce Josephine was cold and entirely political. She was in her late 40s and had not produced a child during their 14 turbulent years of marriage. In December 1809, in the Grand Cabinet of the Tuileries, she read a prepared statement of devotion to the state, then collapsed into sobs and had to be carried from the room. Napoleon wept openly. He told those present that France's political destiny demanded the sacrifice. He married the 18-year-old Archduchess Marie-Louise of Austria, daughter of the emperor he had just defeated. Among the old revolutionary veterans, the union was deeply unpopular. She was the niece of Marie Antoinette. When a son was born in March 1811, a 101-gun salute echoed across Paris, and an extravagant silver-gilt cradle was presented to the infant. The dynasty, it seemed, was secured. Beneath the celebrations, though, the empire was fracturing. The demand for fresh troops never let up. Armed flying columns scoured the countryside hunting draft dodgers who had fled into forests to avoid conscription. Villages lost their young men systematically, leaving the fields to women and the elderly. Some conscripts chopped off their own trigger fingers. Others knocked out their front teeth so they could not bite open the paper musket cartridges required to load a weapon. When the flying columns found a fugitive's family, they quartered soldiers in the home, consumed the winter food stores, and imposed ruinous daily fines until the hiding son finally surrendered. The system worked in the sense that it produced soldiers. What it also produced was hatred. The continental system was already strangling the empire's own commercial hubs. The taxation needed to sustain a standing army of over 1 million men drained the satellite kingdoms dry. And in Russia, the alliance forged on that famous raft at Tilsit was falling apart. Tsar Alexander viewed the French-controlled Duchy of Warsaw as a direct military threat to his borders. In December 1810, he abandoned the continental system entirely, opening Russian ports to neutral ships carrying British goods and slapping punitive tariffs on French luxury imports. The economic defiance struck at the heart of French grand strategy. Negotiation was over. What came next would require every young man, every horse, and every sack of grain the empire could master. In the spring of 1812, something extraordinary gathered along the rivers and roads of Eastern Europe. Over 600,000 soldiers drawn from virtually every corner of the continent assembled into the largest army the world had ever seen. Italians, Poles, Germans, Swiss, and French marched alongside one another in a sprawling multilingual column that stretched for miles. 200,000 horses pulled the cavalry, the artillery, and the enormous cumbersome supply wagons. Polish lancers rode with hopes of winning a free homeland. Bavarian conscripts trudged forward with dread, dragged far from their families to fight in a war they barely understood. The preparations had been exhaustive. Millions of rations were stockpiled in fortified depots along the Vistula River, loaded onto heavy wagons meant to follow the army east. And yet the plan was flawed from the start. The distances involved, over 800 kilometers from the border to Moscow, far exceeded what early 19th century transport could manage. The roads of Eastern Europe were unpaved dirt tracks, and the iron-rimmed wagons sank into them almost immediately. The supply lines broke down within days of the campaign's opening. The army crossed the Neman River in late June, entering Russian territory without a formal declaration of war. As Napoleon approached the riverbank, his horse stumbled and threw him to the ground. Someone on the general staff muttered, "That is a bad omen. A Roman would recross the river." The column pressed on regardless, flowing across 3 heavy pontoon bridges into the vast interior. The Russian high command knew they were vastly outnumbered and chose to fall back. They retreated deep into their own territory, ordering a scorched earth policy as they went. Crops, livestock, shelter, anything of use was to be destroyed. The aim was simple: deny the French everything. But the cost of that strategy fell on the people who could bear it least. Russian serfs living at subsistence level watched as imperial officers and Cossack detachments arrived to burn their autumn harvests. For many, losing that grain meant starvation come winter. Some communities fought back, clashing with their own army in desperate skirmishes to protect what little they had. In the end, the Russian state torched its own countryside far more thoroughly than the French vanguard ever managed, creating a wasteland of starving civilians long before the invaders arrived. The retreat caused fury within the Russian officer corps. Barclay Dully, the Minister of War, orchestrated the withdrawal with cold discipline. But commanders like Prince Bagration viewed the constant surrender of Russian soil as a profound humiliation. He raged openly against his superiors, demanding a chance to stand and fight. The ordinary soldiers felt much the same, marching eastward in simmering confusion, unable to understand why they were giving their country away without a battle. Meanwhile, the heat of the Russian summer was already destroying the Grand Army from within. Sudden thunderstorms turned the dirt roads into knee-deep swamps, halting the wagons and forcing thirsty soldiers to drink from stagnant infected puddles. Typhus and dysentery swept through the tightly packed columns, killing tens of thousands of men before they had fired a single shot. Within the first month, over 80,000 horses died of starvation and exhaustion, their bloated bodies lining the route. Without light cavalry, the French lost their ability to scout Russian positions or forage for food in the surrounding countryside. The army was going blind. The first major clash came at Smolensk in August. The Russians fortified the city's massive medieval walls and repelled repeated French assaults. Artillery bombardment ignited the wooden buildings inside, turning the city into a raging inferno. Then, under cover of night, the Russian army slipped away, leaving the French to occupy a smoldering ruin. Charred civilian corpses lay in the streets. Survivors picked through the wreckage of their homes, The loss of Smolensk pushed morale to a breaking point, and Tsar Alexander finally intervened. He appointed General Kutuzov to overall command, a veteran respected enough to hold the fractured officer corps together. Cutout halted the retreat at a small village called Borodino, 120 kilometers west of Moscow, and ordered the construction of massive earthen fortifications packed with hundreds of artillery pieces. The battle on the 7th of September was a brutal frontal slugfest. French infantry walked directly into Russian cannon fire, sustaining horrific casualties just to reach the base of the earthworks. Inside the redoubts, the fighting became hand-to-hand bayonets, clubbed muskets, bare fists. The positions changed hands again and again throughout the day. Napoleon's marshals begged him to commit the Imperial Guard and finish the thing. He refused. At 800 leagues from France, I will not have my guard destroyed. The decision allowed the battered Russian army to withdraw in good order under darkness. Over 70,000 men lay dead or wounded on the field. Thousands more lacking medical supplies were left to die on the freezing open ground. The French entered Moscow on the 14th of September, expecting a formal surrender. They found a ghost city. The governor had ordered the population evacuated and released criminals from the prisons with incendiary devices and orders to burn it all. Fires broke out almost immediately, fanned by high winds, raging for 4 days and consuming 4/5 of the city. French soldiers looted the burning mansions, stumbling through smoke in stolen silk gowns, clutching silver plates, still desperately short of bread. Napoleon lingered in the ashes for 5 weeks, waiting for the Tsar to sue for peace. Alexander ignored every message. He knew the winter was coming. The first heavy snow fell in mid-October. The army would starve if it stayed. The retreat began on the 19th of October, the column burdened with looted treasure and thousands of civilian camp followers. Russian forces blocked the southern route at Maloyara-Levitz, pushing the French back along the same devastated road they had marched in summer. There was nothing left to eat. Temperatures dropped to -30. Men without winter clothing wrapped themselves in stolen carpets and raw animal skins. Frostbite claimed fingers and noses. Starving soldiers ate their dying horses raw. Cossack cavalry and partisan bands harassed the flanks constantly, cutting down anyone who fell behind. Entire regiments of Italian and German conscripts dropped dead in the snowdrifts thousands of kilometers from home. In early December, reading reports of a coup attempt back in Paris, Napoleon handed command to Marshal Murat and slipped away in a fast sleigh, traveling incognito across hostile German territory. He left his dying army behind to secure his political grip on the capital. The final agony came at the Borodino River in late November. Russian armies closed in from 3 directions, trapping the remnants against the western bank. Dutch engineers under General A worked chest deep in the freezing water, wrestling wooden trestles into the current to build 2 fragile bridges. Nearly all of them died of hypothermia afterward. When Russian artillery began dropping shells into the mass of stragglers waiting to cross, panic erupted. Thousands were trampled to death or drowned in the ice-choked river. The core of the army escaped, but the Grande Armée was finished. Hundreds of thousands of dead lay scattered across the snow behind them. Across the Atlantic, the same economic warfare that had driven the army into Russia was igniting a second conflict. The Continental System and the British Orders in Council had strangled neutral American shipping for years. Infuriated by the seizure of their vessels and the impressment of their sailors, the United States declared war on Britain and launched a disastrously uncoordinated invasion of Canada. The war featured surprising American naval victories in single ship engagements, proof that the policies shaping the catastrophe in Russia had dragged a distant continent into the same widening fire. The destruction of the Grand Army shattered the spell that had held Europe in submission. 500,000 men were gone. The imperial center lay exposed across the continent. Former allies sensed the weakness, broke their treaties, and began to mobilize. The survivors limping back across the Rhine would find no rest. A unified coalition was already forming behind them, armed and determined, ready to drive them all the way back to Paris. The news from Russia arrived in fragments. Rumors at first, then dispatches, then the hollow faces of survivors trudging westward through the German snow. The Grand Army, that vast instrument of imperial will, had been swallowed whole by the Russian winter. And across Central Europe, people began to sense that something fundamental had shifted. In December of 1812, General Yorck von Wartenberg, commanding the Prussian corps that had been forced to march alongside the French, signed the Convention of Tarragon. His troops would fight no more for Paris. It was a spontaneous act of defiance, and it lit a fuse that ran straight through the German heartland. Prussia formalized the break in February of 1813, signing the Treaty of Kalisz with Russia and pledging 80,000 soldiers to the cause. King Frederick William III issued his proclamation and Mindfolk, calling directly upon the people to rise in a war of national liberation. He introduced the Iron Cross, a military honor awarded regardless of social class. The Sixth Coalition had its core. And back in Paris, the imperial administration scrambled. The desperation was total. Depots were stripped bare. The conscription classes of 1814 were called up a full year early. These raw recruits, many of them teenagers, were nicknamed the Mar-Louises after the emperors who signed the decrees that sent them to war. They arrived at the German front, lacking uniforms, horses, and basic training. The army that had once been the most feared professional fighting force in Europe now looked like something else entirely. Even so, the French managed hard-fought victories at Loudun and Boughton that May, but without enough cavalry to pursue the retreating Russo-Russian forces, those wins led nowhere. The enemy fell back in good order, preserved their strength, and waited. Both sides were bleeding badly. A summer armistice was agreed. It would prove to be a fatal pause because during those weeks of quiet, Austria made up its mind. The decisive moment came in Dresden inside the Marilini Palace, where the emperor met the Austrian foreign minister Clemens von Metternich for 9 volatile hours. Metternich laid out his terms. Dismantle the Grand Empire. Return France to its natural borders. The emperor refused with fury, reportedly hurling his hat to the ground. "I know how to die," he said, "but I will not yield an inch of territory." Metternich left the room with a quiet certainty. "You are lost, sir," he told him. Austria joined the coalition. The Allied force now numbered over 800,000 men operating under the Trachenberg Plan, a coordinated strategy designed to avoid engaging the emperor directly while picking off his isolated marshals one by one. It all came to a head in October of 1813 outside the Saxon city of Leipzig. Over 500,000 soldiers converged on a single area, along with thousands of artillery pieces. The engagement lasted 3 days. Russian, Prussian, Austrian, and Swedish armies pressed inward from every direction, grinding the outnumbered French into a shrinking perimeter. The artillery bombardment shook the ground for miles. Black powder smoke hung so thick over the field that men could barely see the ranks beside them. And then the Saxon allies mutinied, turning their cannons on the French and firing point-blank into the lines of their former comrades. The retreat through Leipzig's narrow streets turned into catastrophe. A terrified corporal prematurely blew the only stone bridge over the swollen Ster River. 30,000 French soldiers were trapped on the wrong bank. Men threw themselves into the freezing water under Russian sniper fire. Marshal Poniatowski, who had received his marshal's baton just days earlier, drowned in the current. What remained of the army limped back across the Rhine, carrying typhus into mainland France and abandoning everything east of it. The German states, the Confederation of the Rhine, the Dutch territories, all gone. By early 1814, nearly 400,000 Allied soldiers had crossed the French frontier, marching on Paris from multiple directions. And here, fighting on his own soil, the emperor produced something remarkable. During the 6 days campaign in February, he maneuvered a force of just 30,000 men to win 4 distinct engagements at Champeaux, Montel, Châteaury, and Vauçon, effectively destroying the vanguard of Bruck's Prussian army. It was brilliant, mobile, furious generalship, but it changed nothing. The coalition simply went around him and marched on the undefended capital. Marshal Marmot, commanding the Paris garrison, negotiated a secret capitulation and marched his entire corps into Austrian lines. At Fontlau, the senior marshals blocked his path. Michel Ney told him plainly that the army would not march on Paris. It would obey its generals. The emperor drafted his abdication, first trying to preserve the throne for his infant son, then surrendering unconditionally when the Allies refused. That night alone, he swallowed a vial of poison he had carried since Russia. The mixture had degraded over time. It made him violently sick but did not kill him. He survived and was made to face what came next. The island of Elba sits between Corsica and the Italian mainland, a rugged, sun-baked place home to around 12,000 people. It was here that the deposed emperor was granted sovereignty under the terms of the Treaty of Fontainebleau. He arrived aboard the British frigate HMS Undaunted in May of 1814, and immediately set about governing the island with the same frantic energy he had once applied to an entire continent. He designed new roads, expanded iron ore mines, reformed agricultural taxes. It was as though the habits of empire could not be switched off, even when the empire had shrunk to a speck in the Mediterranean. The whole setup was a strange miniature replica of what he'd built before. There was a tiny royal court, a personal guard of 600 veteran soldiers who had followed him voluntarily into exile, and a naval fleet consisting of a single brig called the Inconstant. His mother, Letizia, and his sister, Pauline, came to keep him company and help with money, which he badly needed. The restored French government had promised him a pension of 2 million francs. They never paid it. The little administration teetered on the edge of bankruptcy almost from the start. Meanwhile, secret couriers brought him a steady stream of reports from the mainland. The news was extraordinary. King Louis XVIII, who had returned to Paris in what many described as the baggage train of the Allies, was deeply unpopular. The Bourbon government had retired thousands of veteran officers on half-pay, replaced their color with the old white flag, and made noises about returning confiscated lands to aristocratic immigrants who had fled during the Revolution. 25 years of social progress felt suddenly under threat. The army was furious. The countryside was restless, and on Ella, the exile was paying very close attention. He also learned that the Congress of Vienna was discussing whether to move him somewhere far more remote, somewhere deep in the Atlantic, beyond any hope of return. That was the final push. A secret departure was planned for late February of 1815. He waited until the British guard ship was temporarily absent, and then, under cover of darkness, the small flotilla slipped out of the harbor at Porto. Just over 1,000 armed men sailed with him. They landed completely unopposed on the southern French coast at Gulf 1. The column moved quickly northward through snow-covered alpine passes, deliberately avoiding royalist strongholds in the Rhône Valley and sticking to the working-class regions of the Dauphiné, where sympathy ran high. The moment that defined everything came just south of Grenoble at the village of Laffa. A battalion of the 5th Line Infantry had been deployed across the road with orders to shoot him on sight. He walked out ahead of his own guards entirely alone, straight toward the leveled muskets. He opened his grey overcoat and called out, "Soldiers of the 5th, do you recognize me? If there is any among you who would kill his emperor, here I am." The line broke. Soldiers wept, rushed forward and embraced his boots, shouting "Vive Lear." After La Frie, the march on Paris became a bloodless procession. Thousands of soldiers deserted the Bourbon cause and joined the advancing column. Cheering peasants lined the roads through every town. Marshal Ney, who had personally sworn to Louis XVIII that he would bring the user back in an iron cage, defected with his entire command. The king fled the Twitter's palace in the middle of the night and crossed into Belgium. And so, without a single shot fired, the returning emperor was carried up the grand staircase of the palace by a mob of hysterical supporters. He had reclaimed the seat of power. The desperate, fragile period known as the 100 Days had begun. The response from the powers assembled at the Congress of Vienna was immediate. On the 13th of March, 1815, they issued a joint declaration that was unprecedented in international law. He was proclaimed an outlaw outside the protection of civil and social relations, an enemy and disturber of the tranquility of the world who had rendered himself liable to public vengeance. Over 700,000 Allied troops began to mobilize. To survive, he had to strike before they could converge. The newly formed Army of the North advanced rapidly across the Sambre River into Belgium, aiming to split the Anglo-Dutch army under Wellington from the Prussian army under Blas. The initial maneuvers caught the coalition off guard. On the 16th of June, he struck the isolated Prussians at Ligy, a brutal, concentrated infantry fight in the burning streets of a small village. The French won, but the victory was undercut by Marshal Ney's failure at the simultaneous Battle of Quatre Bras, where he didn't secure the vital crossroads and allowed Wellington to withdraw in good order. A torrential rainstorm on the 17th turned the Belgian countryside into a deep quagmire and slowed the French pursuit. Wellington used the delay to dig in along the ridge of Monsanju, anchoring his flanks on the fortified farmhouses of Hugamo and Leysa. The Battle of Waterloo opened late on the morning of the 18th, delayed so the ground could dry enough for French artillery. The assault on Hougoumont, intended as a diversion, escalated into a grinding slaughter that swallowed entire French units without breaking the British right flank. Then Ney, misreading the movement of British casualties as a retreat, sent the heavy cavalry charging unsupported up the muddy slope against unbroken infantry squares. The cuirass went again and again. Clear's throat the British bayonets held. Late in the afternoon, the Prussians emerged from the woods to the east and struck the exposed French right at Planceau. It was the decisive blow. In desperation, the legendary Old Guard was committed in a final assault on Wellington Centre. Point-blank musketry shattered it. Panic spread through the French lines like fire through dry grass, and the Army of the North dissolved into a fleeing mob on the muddy slopes of Morsonga. The political gamble of the 100 days died on that field. He fled back to Paris, where the legislative chambers turned openly hostile. A second abdication followed. Then a desperate dash to the Atlantic coast with Prussian cavalry units closing in behind him. At Rashford, every escape route was severed by the Royal Navy blockade. There was nothing left to do. He surrendered on the deck of a British warship, formally and finally removed from the board. The powers who had spent over 2 decades fighting him could at last begin to rebuild. The formal surrender took place on the deck of HMS Bellerophon on the 15th of July 1815. The deposed emperor handed himself over to Captain Frederick Mateland, apparently expecting political asylum somewhere in the English countryside. A quiet estate, perhaps a gentleman's retirement. The British government had other ideas. They were terrified of his political influence. Even now, even in defeat, they refused to recognize his imperial title. The ship was ordered to remain anchored offshore while they decided what to do with him. The decision, when it came, was brutally pragmatic. He would be exiled to the most remote, most inescapable place on earth. He was transferred to HMS Northumberland and transported across the Atlantic to the island of Saint Helena. A desolate volcanic rock jutting from the South Atlantic over 900 kilometers from the nearest point on the African coast and ringed by British artillery batteries. There would be no escape from this one. His designated residence was Longwood House, a former summer retreat for the East India Company perched on a damp, wind-blasted plateau. The conditions were genuinely miserable. Rats infested the building. The floorboards rotted from the constant damp. A thick, depressing fog routinely settled over the grounds, and the health of his entire French entourage deteriorated steadily in the gloom. It was the kind of place that seemed designed to make a person shrink. The relationship between the captive and the island's British governor, Sir Hudson Lowe, collapsed almost immediately into a petty, vindictive psychological war. Lowe rationed the household's firewood and wine. He posted armed sentries outside the windows at night. He refused to deliver any mail addressed to the emperor, insisting on the designation General Bonaparte. These were small, deliberate humiliations administered with bureaucratic precision, and they ground on day after day, year after year in the fog. Stripped of all political power, the exile turned his immense, restless energy towards something he could still control, his legacy. Working closely with the devoted Emmanuel de Lacus, he dictated what would become the Memorial de Saint Helena, a massive text in which he carefully presented himself as a liberal martyr. In this version of events, his wars had all been defensive, fought against oppressive monarchies, waged to spread the progressive ideals of the French Revolution across a backward continent. It was, of course, a selective reading of history, but it was a compelling one, and it would prove enormously influential. His physical decline was rapid, severe abdominal pain, constant vomiting, a noticeable, alarming loss of body weight. He died on the 5th of May, 1821 at the age of 51. The subsequent British autopsy revealed a massive perforated ulcer in his stomach. Stomach cancer, the same disease that had killed his father. The finding permanently dispelled the persistent rumors of arsenic poisoning by the British. Though those rumors would linger in certain circles for generations, what happened next was unexpected. The British military garrison on the island, men who had spent their adult lives fighting against his armies across the mountains of Spain and the muddy fields of Belgium, filed past the small Campi Bede in solemn procession to view his body. Many of them wept openly. The sheer physical reality of the pale, emaciated corpse dissolved something. The terrifying mythological monster of decades of British wartime propaganda simply wasn't there anymore. Just a dead man on a bed. There was an immense heavy sense of finality among the ranks. He was dressed in the iconic green uniform of the Chasseur à Cheval of the Imperial Guard. The crimson ribbon of the Legion of Honor pinned in place. 4 nested coffins, tin, lead, mahogany, sealed the body. British grenadiers carried him in relays to a quiet willow-shaded valley on the island with full military honors. Even in death, the arguments continued. The British governor insisted the tombstone read Napoleon Bonaparte. The French entourage demanded the singular imperial Napoleon. Neither side would yield, and so the heavy stone slab that covered the muddy grave was left completely blank. While the captive had been slowly dying in the South Atlantic, the victorious powers of Europe had already convened the Congress of Vienna. Their task was enormous. They had to redraw the map of a continent that had been ripped apart over 20 years of continuous warfare. The negotiations were dominated by four figures: the conservative Austrian Foreign Minister Clemens von Metternich, the pragmatic British Foreign Secretary Viscount Casteria, the deeply mystical Tsar Alexander I of Russia, and the brilliant, slippery French diplomat Talleyrand. Talleyrand's performance was remarkable. Representing a defeated, occupied nation, he exploited the growing divisions between the victors over the fate of Poland and Saxony. He positioned France as the defender of smaller, vulnerable nations. He maneuvered the restored Bourbon monarchy back into the inner circle of great power decision-making. It was diplomatic manipulation of the highest order, and the overriding objective of the Congress, shared by all parties, was the restoration of the old balance of power. They wanted a conservative international system built to suppress any future democratic revolution anywhere at any cost. France was pushed back to its borders of 1790, forced to pay a crippling financial indemnity, and saddled with the deeply unpopular Bourbon monarchy under King Louis V 18th. To contain future French aggression, the Congress built strong buffer states along the borders. Belgium and Holland were merged into the United Kingdom of the Netherlands. Prussia received massive new territories in the industrial Rhineland. Austria regained its dominance over the Italian peninsula, erasing the modern republics that had been established over the previous 2 decades and returning the region to a patchwork of conservative duchies ruled by Habsburg cousins. The Congress formally established the Concert of Europe, an unprecedented system of regular international congresses and mutual military guarantees. The major powers agreed to intervene across borders to crush liberal uprisings wherever they occurred. Monarchical stability came first. National self-determination came nowhere. This deeply conservative system would successfully prevent another continent-wide war for exactly 100 years, holding the line until the catastrophic outbreak of the First World War in 1914. The cost of the previous 2 decades was staggering. An estimated 5 to 7 million people had died during the continuous global warfare. The human toll extended far beyond the battlefields themselves. The relentless demands of annual conscription had reached deep into the countryside, pulling young men from their communities for years at a time. The demographic hole left village economies reeling. Families faced severe grinding poverty, their structures permanently ruptured by the absence of sons and husbands. Hundreds of thousands of maimed veterans returned to their rural homes, missing limbs, permanently blinded by exploding black powder or suffering from psychological trauma that had no name and no treatment. These men relied on overstretched church charities and inadequate state pensions for their daily survival. Continental industry had been crippled by the disruptions of the continental system and the deliberate destruction of bridges and roads by retreating armies. Britain emerged from the wreckage as the unquestioned global power. Its domestic industrial infrastructure was untouched. Its financial system in London was the most sophisticated on earth. The Royal Navy was physically larger and more heavily armed than all other global navies combined. British merchants monopolized the markets of Asia, Africa, and Latin America. The defeat of France marked the beginning of the Pax Britannica, a full century of imperial dominance that would shape the architecture of the modern global economy. The legacy of the fallen emperor, though, extended well beyond the battlefields. 2 decades of French occupation had fundamentally rewired the daily reality of life in annexed territories from Belgium to the Rhineland and the Italian peninsula. The centralized state administration had dismantled old feudal jurisdictions, abolished internal tolls, dissolved ancient urban guilds, and created unified national markets. Vast tracts of confiscated church and aristocratic lands had been auctioned off, transferring enormous wealth to an ascendant class of merchants and professionals. The state had taken control of education and welfare, introduced civil marriage, and granted legal emancipation to Jewish communities in states like Westphalia and the Italian republics. The Napoleonic Code established equality before the law and the inviolability of private property. Even after the French armies retreated, modernizing states retained these efficient legal frameworks. They formed the basis of civil law systems stretching from Latin America to the Middle East. The Congress of Vienna tried to cram these newly empowered social classes back into their old positions. The restored regimes favored aristocratic landowners and the returning church hierarchy. They attempted to reinstate ecclesiastical authority and feudal dues. This deeply alienated the new winners of the Napoleonic era, the propertied middle class, the professional administrators trained in uniform bureaucratic systems, and the religious minorities who had briefly tasted equal citizenship. You cannot reimpose feudal obligations on citizens who have spent 15 years, holding legal title to their own land and paying uniform taxes under a modern legal code. The friction between the reactionary political settlement and the transformed social reality made the Restoration structurally unstable from the start. And it served as the direct cause of the revolutions that would violently detonate in 1830 and 1848. The era forged national identities that would define the 19th century and beyond. The humiliation of the Prussian defeat at Jena triggered a wave of German cultural and political nationalism, sparking the long process that would culminate in the unification of the German Empire. The lived experience of the Kingdom of Italy, a unified administration, a modern national military, planted the seeds of the Risorgimento, giving Italian patriots a tangible memory of a united peninsula free from Austrian domination. Those incredibly dense 51 years shattered the ancient assumption that political power and social status were ordained by divine right and noble birth. The rapid ascent of a minor, heavily accented provincial artillery officer to the throne of an empire stretching from Madrid to Moscow was proof of something. It demonstrated that an individual could forge their own destiny through intellect, willpower, and ambition. The concept of the career open to talents, where advancement was based on proven merit rather than aristocratic bloodline, became a permanent disruptive ideal. It threatened every conservative monarchy on the planet and rewired the expectations of the emerging middle classes across Europe. In the decades after the death on Saint Helena, the figure of the emperor rapidly transcended the historical reality of the man. Writers, poets, and philosophers across the continent, from Goethe to Byron to Hegel, saw him as the embodiment of raw human potential. The world spirit on horseback, Hegel called him, a force that had ripped apart the stagnant feudal order to drag humanity into modernity. That a single life defined by immense bloodshed and strict dictatorial control could simultaneously become an enduring symbol of individual human agency speaks to the complexity of the legacy. It remains contested, heavily debated, and permanently woven into how we think about the limits of power and ambition. The blank stone slab in that remote Atlantic valley marked the physical end of the emperor, sealing the era of massive cavalry charges and continent-spanning armies into the realm of history. The conservative monarchs gathering in the gilded halls of Vienna believed they had successfully turned back the clock, restoring the ancient quiet obedience of the European populace. But the explosive ideals of nationalism, meritocracy, and rational civil law had merely been forced underground, where they spread rapidly through intellectual salons and working-class taverns across the continent. The revolutions that would detonate in 1830 and 1848 would prove exactly how deeply the seeds of the imperial era had been planted, guaranteeing that the ghost of the emperor would continue to shape the political destiny of the world long after the guns had fallen silent. So, was Napoleon Bonaparte a hero or an oppressor? The answer, like the man himself, defies easy labels. He gave Europe modern laws and shattered feudal chains, but he built his empire on the bones of millions. He was both the heir of the revolution and its gravedigger. Perhaps that is the only honest conclusion. History is rarely kind enough to hand us simple answers. If you enjoyed this journey through the life and legacy of Napoleon, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to Oliver's Stories. It truly helps the channel grow. Drop a comment below with your thoughts. Do you see him as a visionary or a tyrant? And let me know where you are watching from. I genuinely check every single one.